Because our Lent Forum series this year is based on a book, Because of This I Rejoice, Reading Philippians During Lent by Max Vincent, we started the first week of the forum with an introduction to Paul's letter to the Philippians. I wanted to make a video summarizing that introduction so that if you missed the first week, you can watch a short video and be caught up to speed on the letter to the Philippians, and then you can join us to keep reading. Here's an archaeological image of the theater in the city of Philippi. Philippi was founded in 360 BC by Philip, the king of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, but it was refounded as a Roman colony in about 40 BC. It was the site of a victory by Octavian, who had become Caesar Augustus, in a civil war. And after his victory, Octavian gave many of his veterans land around the city, and it became a Roman colony. That meant there were many Roman citizens living there. Many of them had served in the military. It was also on a major road linking Rome, the city in the west, to its wealthy colonies in the east. Egypt and Syria produced large amounts of wealth and also agricultural products and food, which fed the city of Rome. And there was a road that ran from the east along northern Greece, where Philippi was, and then up into Italy and Rome, which allowed both soldiers to move from east to west and allowed agricultural goods and other products to be brought from one place to another. You can compare this situation where Philippi is a Roman colony to Corinth, which was another city in which Paul had founded a church where the first and second letters to the Corinthians are addressed. And Corinth had also been recently refounded. It was an old Greek city and had been refounded as a Roman military colony. And of course, one of Paul's longest and most famous letters is his letter to the Romans. So you can see this sort of way in which Paul, who says that he's a Roman citizen, finds it very appealing to work with other Roman citizens. So Paul arrives in Philippi by sea in 49 CE, which is before he arrives in Corinth. And we hear the story of this in the book of Acts. This is around 15 years after Jesus' death. That makes Philippi the first church that Paul founded in what's now Europe, as opposed to in the areas that are now part of Turkey or Syria or Israel. Here's an artist's rendering of the city of Philippi. You can see in particular the theater in the sort of right-hand corner that we saw the archaeological image of, and also going from the bottom right of the picture to the top left, that long straight road. There was something like the interstate highway system in our world today, intentionally built and maintained very well, both to allow the army to move quickly across the empire, but also to allow commerce. So here's a quick map of Paul's 3 missionary journeys. You can see starting in red, a very short journey around some areas that are close to where Paul lives. Paul grew up in Tarsus in the southern part of what's now Turkey. The second journey in orange travels throughout what's now Turkey, and it's there that we begin to see some of Paul's churches that he founded popping up. The third journey is in yellow and covers much of the same territory, and then the fourth journey, which is in green, is Paul's final voyage to Rome, during which he's imprisoned and is going to stand trial. Now, Paul's earliest letter was to the church in Thessalonica, the first and second letters to the Thessalonians, but he wrote to many other churches in the same general geographic area, so you can see how Paul's career, the letters that he wrote, mapped onto his travels. His next letter was to the Galatians in the southern part of what's now Turkey, then to the Corinthians in what's now Greece, to the Philippians, which we'll be looking at during this forum, then to the Romans, to the Colossians, and to the Ephesians. It's disputed whether the letters to the Colossians and the Ephesians were actually written by Paul or a follower of Paul, but Paul certainly was responsible for founding the churches there, and Paul's disciples continue to be involved in them. Of all of these letters, the only one that was written to a church that Paul hadn't personally founded was the letter to the Romans. So the letter to the Philippians itself doesn't give us much detail about Paul's ministry in Philippi. but the book of Acts does in chapter 16. It tells the story in which Paul is traveling in what's now Turkey, the area called Asia Minor, part of the continent of Asia, separated by the Aegean Sea from Europe. And Paul sees in a dream a man who tells him to come and help us. So he crosses over into Europe. And one of the first cities he goes to is Philippi. Paul and his companions go down by the river to a place where they've heard that there's a synagogue, and they meet there a woman named Lydia, who's a dealer in purple dye, which makes her quite a wealthy woman, and she becomes an early patron of Paul's church there. This is typical of many of the early Christian churches, which had wealthy women supporting them. We hear this about Jesus' own ministry, and we also hear about many of Paul's churches in his letters. They then meet a young woman who's a slave who is possessed by a spirit that gives her sort of fortune-telling powers. Paul and his companions cast this spirit out of her, which makes her owners quite angry because this was their source of income. Rather than putting her to work as a domestic servant or working in a field, she is telling people's fortunes. And now that Paul has cast out this demon, the owners have lost their ability to profit off of this woman whom they've enslaved. So there's a sort of mob who beat Paul up, throw him into jail, and accuse him of violating their sort of social norms, of teaching customs that it's not lawful for Roman citizens to observe. But Paul and his companions are praying and singing hymns in their jail, and in the middle of the night there's an earthquake, and the doors are unlocked, and they have the opportunity to escape. Their jailer, when he realizes this, is quite despondent, but Paul shouts out, "Don't worry, we're still here." The jailer is so thankful that he immediately converts to Christianity and follows Paul. Throughout this, there's all a thread of citizenship, and this is something that will show up in the letter to the Philippians as well. Philippi is a Roman military colony. Many of the people who live in Philippi are citizens of Rome. Paul himself is a citizen of Rome. He's accused of teaching things that go against Roman law, a sort of sedition, or teaching things, namely Judaism, that are unlawful for Roman citizens to follow because it would prevent them from sacrificing to the emperor or to the Roman gods. But Paul himself uses his own citizenship. At the very end of the story, after he's escaped from prison, he says, I can't believe that you would take us and throw us into jail without any charges or any trial. And we're Roman citizens, and everyone sort of gasps. And the expectation is that it's a surprise that Paul's a Roman citizen, and that they wouldn't have done this if they had known. Citizenship is a theme that comes up in the letter to the Philippians in several places, and I think we'll talk about it more over the course of this series. The circumstances of Paul's letter to the Philippians are a little unclear. Paul is in jail. He's not in prison in the sense that he's being punished having been convicted of a crime. He's in jail awaiting trial. They didn't have punitive imprisonment in the ancient world. He would have been put in jail, put on trial, and then punished in some way, flogged or executed or so on. There's a fellow named Epaphroditus who's mentioned a couple times in the letter. It seems that Paul has founded the church in Philippi. He's continued to be in touch with them. Various people have gone back and forth. And Paul seems to be imprisoned in the city of Ephesus, which is a few days' travel away. The Philippians have sent a young man named Epaphroditus to work with Paul. Paul's very fond of him. They seem to have been co-workers. Paul refers to him as a fellow soldier and so on. But then Epaphroditus has become quite ill. The Philippians seem to have heard of this and to have sent someone to Paul asking after him. And Paul sends this letter back saying, Epaphroditus is well, but I'm sending him back to you, and thanks for sending him with me. And Epaphroditus seems to have carried this letter for Paul. This was very common in the ancient world. There wasn't a postal service that you could just take advantage of. If you wanted a letter to be sent from one place to another, you gave it to a friend who was traveling that way. So the occasion for Paul's writing this letter is his return of Epaphroditus back to Philippi. It's pretty unclear when exactly it was written. I think that the best consensus is that it was sometime in the mid-50s. It's very hard to date the career of Paul, but in any case, it would have taken place about 20 years between 15 and 25 years, right after the crucifixion of Jesus, so relatively early in the spread of Christianity, and around a decade, give or take a few years, into Paul's career. What's really remarkable about this letter is its tone. In many of his letters, Paul is trying to clear up some kind of conflict in the community he's writing to, either a conflict that they're having with one another or a conflict that he's having with them. And in everything except the letter to the Romans, these are churches he's worked with closely. In Philippians, it's really a tone of friendship and warmth. You can see how much Paul values this community that he's founded and how much he longs still to be involved in their life. So as we study the letter to the Philippians, one chapter a week during Lent, I'd encourage you to remember some of this context, and we'll draw on it from time to time as we continue reading the letter.